There are places in America that simply don't appear on tourist maps. Not because they don't exist, because someone decided they shouldn't. In 2011, one small section of Yellowstone National Park was quietly sealed off. No press conference, no public explanation, only silence. The first thing you need to understand is that Yellowstone is not one place. People hear the name and they think of Old Faithful, bison in the road, families posing in front of prismatic springs. They think of a postcard. But Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres of land, most of which no tourist will ever see. There are entire valleys with no trails leading into them. There are thermal basins that don't appear on any visitor map because the ground is too unstable, or because the Park Service simply never got around to surveying them properly. There are zones that were last formally assessed in the 1970s, and within those zones, there are areas that were quietly closed and never reopened. And if you ask why, the answer you get depends entirely on who you ask and how far they're willing to go before they stop talking. This is about one of those areas. I'm going to be as specific as I can about what happened, but I want to be honest from the beginning. There are parts of this I still don't have clean answers for. I've spoken to 3 people who were directly involved, 2 of whom asked me not to use their names. The third didn't ask, but I'm going to protect his identity anyway, because after our last conversation, he stopped returning my calls, and I think that says enough. I'll call him Lyndon. That's not his name. He was a seasonal wildlife technician with the National Park Service, stationed in Yellowstone from April through October of 2011. His job, broadly, was to assist with ungulate population surveys, GPS collar maintenance, and occasional backcountry patrols in coordination with the ranger staff. He had worked 2 prior seasons in Glacier and 1 in North Cascades, so he wasn't new to remote fieldwork. He was 31 years old, in good physical condition, and by his own description, not someone who scared easily. The area in question is in the southern portion of the park. I won't name the exact drainage, but it sits between the Thoroughfare region and the Beckler River corridor, in a stretch of backcountry that even experienced hikers rarely enter. To reach it on foot requires a minimum of 2 full days of travel from the nearest trailhead, through terrain that alternates between dense lodgepole pine forest and open marshy meadows fed by geothermal runoff. The ground in many places is warm to the touch. In some places it's hot. Steam rises from fissures you can't always see until you're standing on them. It is genuinely dangerous country, and the Park Service has always treated it as such. But the closure of this particular zone, roughly 4 square miles, was not related to geothermal hazards, at least not officially. When it was formally restricted in the autumn of 2011, the internal documentation listed the reason as resource protection and ecological sensitivity. That's a catch-all phrase. It can mean nearly anything. It can mean there's a rare plant species. It can mean there's an active wolf den. It can mean the soil is eroding. It gives no information, and that is precisely the point. Lyndon was part of the last team that entered the area before it was closed. He told me this over the phone in March of 2019. He had left the Park Service years earlier, transitioned into private environmental consulting, and seemed to carry the experience the way some people carry an old injury, not always visible, but always present. He didn't bring it up casually. I had contacted him after finding his name in a public comment he'd submitted during a 2016 environmental review for a geothermal monitoring expansion in the park's southern zone. His comment was brief, professional, and included one sentence that caught my attention. He wrote, "I would urge the review committee to consult the full incident documentation from the Sector 7G closure before approving any personnel deployment south of the Ferris Fork drainage." The comment was noted in the public record, and no response to it was ever published. When I reached him, he was cautious at first. He asked me how I had found his name. I told him. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "I left that comment because I thought someone should, but I didn't think anyone would actually read it." The events he described to me took place over the course of 5 days, in late September of 2011. He was part of a 3-person team, sent into the area to retrieve a malfunctioning GPS collar from a bull elk that had been tagged the previous spring. The collar had been transmitting erratic location data for several weeks, pinging from coordinates that were, in his words, thermally implausible. The elk appeared to be spending extended periods in areas where ground temperatures exceeded 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not survivable for a large mammal. Not for hours, certainly not for days. The assumption was that the collar had partially failed and was transmitting ghost data, or that it had detached and was sitting in a hot spring somewhere, slowly being dissolved by sulfuric acid. Either way, they needed to recover it or confirm its loss. The team consisted of Lyndon, a senior wildlife biologist I'll call Caro, and a backcountry ranger named Dahl. They departed from a trailhead near the south boundary on September 22nd, carrying 5 days' worth of supplies. The weather was cool, overcast, typical for late September at that elevation. They followed a known but unmarked route along the upper drainage of a tributary creek, moving south-southeast into the closure candidate zone. They had permits, radio contact with a dispatch station at Grant Village, and were expected to check in twice daily. The first day was unremarkable. They covered roughly 14 miles and made camp on a dry bench above the creek. Lyndon described the landscape as monotonous in places. Long corridors of standing dead timber from the 1988 fires, interspersed with younger growth and the occasional meadow. The only notable feature was the smell. Even at that distance, the air carried a faint mineral tang, sulfurous and warm. Not unusual for Yellowstone, but persistent. On the morning of the second day, they entered what Lyndon called the soft zone. This was his term for the transitional area where the ground began to change. The soil became lighter in color, powdery in places, with crusted surfaces that crunched underfoot. Small vents released thin streams of steam at irregular intervals. The creek they'd been following had warmed noticeably. Not hot, but warm enough that it no longer felt like a mountain stream. It felt like bath water that had been sitting for an hour. By midday, they reached the last known coordinates of the elk collar. The GPS data pointed to a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines, most of which were dead. Not recently dead, long dead, but still standing, their bark stripped away, their trunks bleached to a pale, almost white color. The ground in the clearing was bare. No grass, no undergrowth, just a smooth, pale surface that looked almost artificial. Lyndon described it as resembling dried clay or packed calcium deposits, like the terraces at Mammoth Hot Springs but flat, and extending uniformly in all directions for perhaps 200 yards. They searched the clearing for the collar. They didn't find it. The GPS data suggested it should have been within a 20-meter radius of where they were standing, but there was nothing. No elk remains, no collar, no sign of animal activity at all. Caro checked the signal on the tracking receiver and confirmed it was still pinging, weakly, from somewhere beneath them, not beside them, below. Lyndon told me that Caro knelt down and placed her hand flat on the ground. She held it there for about 10 seconds and then pulled it away. She said the ground was warm, not hot, not dangerously so, but uniformly warm, like a surface that had been heated from underneath and was slowly radiating. She estimated the temperature at around 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfortable, almost, but wrong, because the ambient air temperature was 48 degrees, and the warmth was everywhere, not localized around a vent or a fissure. The entire clearing, all 200 yards of it, was radiating the same even heat. Dahl, the ranger, pointed out something else. The trees at the edge of the clearing were dead, as I mentioned, but they weren't just dead. They were standing in a near-perfect circle, not a rough, natural boundary, but something closer to geometric. Lyndon said he didn't notice it at first, because when you're standing inside a circle, you don't perceive it as one. You just see trees. But once Dahl pointed it out, once he traced the curve with his hand and Lyndon followed it around the perimeter, it became obvious. The live forest stopped and the dead ring began along a line that was almost unnervingly precise, as if something in the soil had killed the trees up to an exact boundary and then stopped. They discussed this for a while. Caro suggested it could be a geothermal feature, a a subsurface hotspot that had expanded to a certain radius and stabilized. That does happen. Yellowstone's thermal features shift and migrate over decades. A new vent can open, kill the vegetation in a growing circle, and then reach some kind of equilibrium. It was a rational explanation, and Lyndon said he accepted it at the time. It made sense. But he also said that it didn't feel right, and he couldn't articulate why. It was something about the uniformity. In his experience, geothermal kill zones are messy. Trees die at different rates. Some resist longer than others. The boundary is ragged, uneven. This was clean. It looked less like something that had grown outward and more like something that had been placed. They made camp that night about a quarter-mile outside the clearing, on the opposite side of the creek. The evening was quiet, unnervingly quiet, Lyndon said, though he corrected himself immediately. He said it wasn't unnerving at the time. At the time, it was just quiet. It became unnerving in retrospect. He explained what he meant. In the backcountry, especially in September, the evenings are full of sound: elk bugling, coyotes, owls, wind through the canopy, insects, though fewer as the season cools, water noise. There are layers. That evening, there was only the creek. No elk, no coyotes, no birds, no wind, just the creek, and beneath it, something he described as a very low vibration. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure, like the air itself was humming at a frequency, just below what the ear could resolve. He said it reminded him of standing near a large electrical transformer, that kind of ambient drone that you feel in your teeth more than you hear. He asked Caro and Dahl if they noticed it. Caro said no. Dahl said he wasn't sure. They ate dinner, checked in with dispatch by radio, and went to sleep. Lyndon woke at approximately 2:15 in the morning. He knew the time because he checked his watch, a habit from years of field work. He was in his tent, in his sleeping bag, and for a moment he didn't know what had woken him. Then he realized it was the temperature. The inside of his tent was warm. Not slightly warm. Warm the way a room is warm when the heating has been running all night. He estimated it was in the mid-60s inside the tent, which, given that the outside temperature should have been in the low 30s, was not possible. He unzipped his bag and lay there, trying to understand it. His first thought was that a thermal vent had opened nearby. His second thought was that the warm ground from the clearing had somehow extended beneath their campsite overnight. He unzipped his tent and looked outside. The creek was still flowing. The air outside was cold, as expected. He could see his breath, but the ground beneath his tent was warm. He could feel it through the tent floor. He put his hand on it and then pulled it away, not because it was too hot, but because it felt organic. That was his word. Organic. He said it felt less like heated rock and more like something living, like the skin of an animal. Smooth, warm, and very faintly pulsing. He told himself he was imagining the pulsing. He went back to sleep, eventually. In the morning, he mentioned it to Caro and Dahl. Caro said her tent had been warm too. She had assumed it was a change in weather. Dahl said nothing. Lyndon described Dahl as being quieter than the day before. Not withdrawn exactly, but economical. As if he were conserving something. Lyndon didn't think much of it at the time. People get quiet in the backcountry. It's not unusual. They returned to the clearing on the morning of the third day, with the intention of conducting a more thorough search for the collar. Caro brought a soil thermometer this time, a probe-style instrument calibrated for field use. She took readings in a grid pattern across the clearing. Every single reading came back at 94.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Every one. Across 200 yards of open ground, the temperature did not vary by even 1/10 of a degree. She took 14 measurements. Lyndon watched her face change as she recorded each one. He said she didn't look frightened. She looked confused, which was somehow worse, because Caro was not a person who was easily confused. She had a doctorate. She had published papers on thermal biology, and she was looking at her thermometer as if it were lying to her. The uniformity was the problem. Natural geothermal features don't behave that way. There's always variation. A hot spot is hotter near the source and cooler at the edges. Temperature gradients are fundamental to how these systems work. A perfectly uniform thermal field across a 200-yard radius doesn't fit any known geological model. Caro said this out loud, to no one in particular. She said, "This doesn't match anything." They widened the search for the collar, moving into the ring of dead trees. Lyndon found something there, though it wasn't the collar. It was a survey marker, a small metal stake driven into the ground, the kind used by geological survey teams to mark reference points. It was old, corroded. The stamped identifier on it was partially illegible, but Lyndon was able to make out a date, 1987, and below it, a series code he didn't recognize. He photographed it. He told me later that when he submitted his field report, the photograph was not included in the final documentation. He was told it had been lost during file transfer. He had kept the original on his personal camera, and he still had it as of 2019, though he declined to share it with me. He also found, about 30 yards from the first marker, a second one. Same vintage, same corrosion, but this one had something else stamped on it. Below the series code, in small block letters, were the words, "No return." He assumed it was a survey instruction. In geological fieldwork, markers are sometimes stamped with shorthand notations. No return could mean, "Do not revisit this station," or "No data return from this point." It's ambiguous. But standing in that clearing, in that perfect circle of dead trees, with the ground warm and humming beneath his boots, Lyndon said the phrase felt less like a technical note and more like a warning. They ate lunch at the edge of the clearing. During the meal, Dahl spoke for the first time that morning. He asked Caro how deep the thermal layer might extend. Caro said she didn't know. She said a standard geothermal feature might have a heat source anywhere from a few meters to several kilometers below the surface. But she added that the uniformity suggested something shallow, something very close to the surface, radiating evenly, like a plate. Dahl nodded slowly and said, "It feels like something's under us." Lyndon told me he didn't react to this at the time. He filed it away. But he also told me that from that point forward, he became aware of a feeling he couldn't shake. It was the feeling that the clearing was not just a place. It was the top of something, a lid, a surface, and whatever was beneath it was aware of them standing on it. He told me this with no drama, no inflection. He said it the way you'd describe the weather. That's what disturbed me most. On the afternoon of the third day, they found the collar. Or rather, they found part of it. It was embedded in the ground near the center of the clearing, partially submerged in the pale, calcium-like soil. Only the antenna was visible, protruding about 2 inches above the surface. Caro attempted to extract it. She dug around it with a hand trowel, expecting to find the rest of the collar a few inches down. She dug for 15 minutes. The collar continued downward. The strap, the housing, the battery unit, all of it extended vertically into the ground, as if it had been pushed straight down or pulled. After 18 inches, she stopped. The soil at that depth was noticeably warmer. She estimated 110 degrees. The collar kept going. They discussed what could have caused this. An animal dying on soft, thermally active ground could, in theory, gradually sink as the surface gave way. But the collar was vertical, perfectly vertical, according to the angle of the exposed antenna. An elk carcass sinking into soft ground would settle at random angles. The collar would be tilted, twisted, compressed. This looked like it had been inserted, like someone had taken it and pushed it, antenna up, straight into the earth. Caro took samples of the surrounding soil. She sealed them in collection vials and placed them in her pack. Lyndon noted that she labeled them with unusual care, writing not just the location and date, but the exact time of collection, down to the minute. He asked her why. She said, "Because I want there to be a record." That evening, they camped again in the same spot as the night before. The ground was warm again. This time, all three of them acknowledged it. Dahl sat outside his tent for a long time, staring in the direction of the clearing. Lyndon asked him what he was looking at. Dahl said, "I'm listening." Lyndon listened too. He heard the creak, He heard the low vibration, the subaudible hum he'd noticed the first night. But this time, there was something else. Intermittent, irregular, but present. A sound like tapping, not on rock, not on wood, on something hollow, like knuckles on the underside of a table. It was coming from the ground. He told me he lay in his tent that night and counted the taps. They came in clusters. 3, then silence. 4, then silence. 2, then silence. No discernible pattern. No rhythm. Just contact. Something making contact with the underside of the surface he was sleeping on. He did not sleep well. On the 4th day, Caro made a decision that Lyndon described as uncharacteristic. She wanted to go back into the clearing and dig. Not for the collar. She wanted to dig to see what was below the surface layer. She wanted to understand the thermal structure, the composition, the depth at which the heat originated. Lyndon said this was the first time he saw genuine scientific urgency in her, a need to know that overrode her usual methodical caution. Dahl opposed the idea. He said they should retrieve what they had, file their report, and recommend a formal geological survey. He said they weren't equipped for excavation in thermally active terrain. He was right, technically, but Caro outranked him, and she wanted to dig. They went back to the clearing. Caro chose a spot about 40 yards from where the collar had been found, and began digging with the hand trowel. Lyndon helped. Dahl stood at the edge of the clearing and watched. The first 6 inches were the pale, calcium-like crust. Below that, the soil became darker, almost charcoal grey, and damp. Not wet, but damp, with a consistency Lyndon described as clay-like and slightly elastic. It compressed when pressed, and slowly returned to shape. The temperature continued to rise. At 12 inches, it was uncomfortable to touch. At 18, Lyndon had to use the trowel exclusively. The heat was too much for bare hands. At 22 inches, the trowel struck something solid. Not rock. The sound was wrong for rock. It was a dull, resonant thud, the kind of sound you get when you tap something dense but not mineral. Caro looked at Lyndon. She tapped again. Same sound. She cleared the surrounding soil from the surface of whatever they'd hit and revealed an area about 8 inches across. It was smooth, dark grey, almost black, slightly curved, and warm, warmer than the soil around it. Caro ran her fingers over it. She pressed. It did not give. She tapped it with the metal end of the trowel and listened. The sound had a quality she described in her field notes as resonant dampening, meaning the object absorbed the impact vibration rather than reflecting it. Whatever it was dense, thermally active, and extended in all directions beyond the 8-inch window they'd cleared. She dug wider. She dug for another 30 minutes, expanding the excavation in a rough circle. The surface continued uniformly in every direction. There were no edges, no seams, no variation in texture or temperature. It was, as far as they could tell, a single continuous surface beneath the entire clearing. 22 inches below a 200-yard circle of bare, thermally uniform ground, there was something solid, something smooth, something that should not have been there. Lyndon told me that this was the moment the experience shifted for him. Up until then, it had been strange, anomalous, interesting even. But standing at the edge of that shallow excavation, looking at that dark, smooth, featureless surface glowing faintly with its own heat, he felt something he had never felt before in the backcountry. He felt observed. Not watched by an animal or a person, observed by something that had no eyes but was nonetheless aware of him. The feeling came, not from the forest or the sky, it came from below, from the surface itself. He stepped back from the hole. Caro continued to examine it. Dahl had not moved from his position at the edge of the clearing. Lyndon looked at him and saw that Dahl's face was expressionless, not calm, not frightened, absent, as if something behind his features had quietly stepped out of the room. "Dahl," Lyndon called. No response. "Dahl." The ranger turned his head. He looked at Lyndon the way you look at someone who has interrupted you during a thought you can't get back. Then he said, very quietly, "It knows we found it." Lyndon asked what he meant. Dahl didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the campsite. That evening, the tapping was louder, not dramatically so, but enough that all three of them heard it without straining. It came from directly below the campsite, and it continued without interruption for hours. The clusters were different now, longer sequences, 5, 6, 7 taps in a row. Still no rhythm, still no pattern, but more insistent, as if whatever was doing it had been encouraged. Caro sat by the fire and made notes. Her handwriting, Lyndon told me, was steady. She recorded everything: the soil composition, the temperature readings, the dimensions of the excavation, the properties of the subsurface object, and the tapping. She listed the tapping as percussive contact from subsurface source, origin unknown, mechanism unknown. She wrote it as a data point. She treated it as evidence. Lyndon admired this, and it terrified him. At some point during the night, the hum changed. Lyndon had grown accustomed to it, the low, subaudible vibration that had been present since their second evening. But around midnight, he felt it shift. It didn't get louder. It didn't change pitch. It seemed to acquire direction, as if it had been radiating uniformly outward and was now focused, aimed. He lay in his tent and felt it moving through the ground beneath him, a focused pulse traveling from the direction of the clearing toward the campsite, passing directly under his body and continuing into the forest beyond. It repeated every 40 seconds or so, a slow, deliberate wave, like the breath of something enormous. He did not tell Caro or Dahl about this. He told me he was afraid that describing it would make it more real. On the 5th day, they left. This was not a group decision. It was Dahl's decision, delivered as an instruction rather than a suggestion. He told them at dawn that they were packing up and hiking out. No further discussion. No debate. Caro protested. She said they needed another day, at minimum, to properly document what they'd found. Dahl looked at her and said, "We need to leave. Today. Now." His tone was flat, and Lyndon told me it carried a quality he associated not with fear, but with certainty. The certainty of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they cannot explain but will not abandon. They packed. They hiked. They reached the trailhead by late afternoon of the following day, having pushed hard and taken minimal breaks. During the hike out, no one spoke about the clearing. They talked about logistics, water, route, mileage, the ordinary language of people performing the ordinary act of walking through a forest. But Lyndon told me that he walked the entire way with the feeling of pressure behind him, as if something at his back were not following him, but watching him recede, watching him leave with something that felt, absurdly, like patience. Within 2 weeks of their return, the area was closed. The restriction was filed internally and posted to the backcountry permit system as a standard resource closure. No press release, no public explanation. The zone was simply removed from the list of areas available for backcountry travel, and the trail registers at nearby trailheads were updated to reflect the change. Lyndon said a ranger he knew at the Lake Village station mentioned casually that a geological survey team had gone in shortly after the closure was filed. He asked the ranger what they'd found. The ranger said he didn't know, but added they came out a day early. Caro submitted her field report and her soil samples to the park's resource management office. Lyndon never saw the report again. He requested a copy 6 months later and was told it was being reviewed. He requested it again the following year and was told it had been archived as part of an ongoing assessment. He was not given access to the archive. The soil samples, to his knowledge, were never analyzed, or if they were, the results were never shared with him. He left the Park Service after the 2012 season. He told me the decision was not directly related to what happened in the clearing, but he also told me that he had not slept well since September of 2011. Not every night, but enough. He described recurring experiences of waking at roughly the same time, 2 to 2:30 in the morning, with the sensation that the floor beneath him was warm. He would touch the floor, and it would be normal, room temperature. But the sensation persisted, sometimes for hours. A slow, even heat radiating upward through whatever surface he was sleeping on. He told me about one other thing, and this is the part that has stayed with me most. In the spring of 2014, he was working a consulting job in Montana, about 150 miles north of Yellowstone. He was staying in a motel in a small town, the kind with thin walls and a gravel parking lot. He woke at 2:17 in the morning. The floor of the motel room was warm, and from somewhere below, muffled but unmistakable, he heard tapping. 3 taps, then silence. 4 taps, then silence. He checked out before dawn. He drove north for 6 hours without stopping. I asked him if he thought the tapping had followed him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't think it followed me. I think it was always there. I think it's always been there, under everything, and now I can hear it." I tried to contact him again in June of 2019. His phone was disconnected. The consulting firm he'd been working for told me he had resigned in April. No forwarding address, no explanation. I found a public records entry for a Linden, initial matching, who had purchased a houseboat in the Florida Keys in May of 2019. I have not been able to confirm this is the same person, but the logic of it strikes me as deliberate. A houseboat, a structure with nothing beneath it but water. Nothing solid, nothing that could carry the sound. I've since tried to access the closure documentation for the area in question through multiple FOIA requests to the National Park Service. Each request has been returned with the same language, almost verbatim. The records you have requested pertain to an ongoing resource management assessment and are exempt from disclosure under Exemption 2 of the Freedom of Information Act. Exemption 2 covers internal agency practices and procedures. It's a common shield for bureaucratic documents of no public interest. It is not typically invoked for geological surveys or wildlife management zones. I've also spoken to 2 other individuals who had peripheral involvement. One was a seasonal interpretive ranger who was stationed at Grant Village in the fall of 2011. She remembered the closure being discussed at a staff meeting. She said the resource management chief described it as precautionary and related to unstable thermal activity. She said no one asked follow-up questions. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that a team of 4 people from the U.S. Geological Survey had arrived at the park in October of that year, shortly after the closure. They stayed for 11 days. They did not interact with park staff. They were housed separately, in a cabin near the south entrance that was normally used for VIP visitors. She saw them once, loading equipment into a vehicle. The equipment, she said, included what appeared to be ground-penetrating radar units and several large cases she didn't recognize. She described the team as quiet, in a way that wasn't normal. She said they looked like people who had been told something they were still processing. The second individual was a retired hydrologist who had worked for the USGs in Yellowstone during the late 1980s and early 90s. I contacted him after finding his name in a database of published thermal surveys for the park's southern region. He was willing to talk, but only in general terms. When I mentioned the specific drainage in the closure, he paused. He asked where I'd gotten my information. I told him. He said, "There was survey work done in that area in 1987. I wasn't part of it, but I knew people who were." I asked what they'd found. He said, "They found a thermal anomaly that didn't fit any existing model. Uniform temperature, unusual subsurface density. It was flagged for follow-up, but the follow-up never happened. The 1988 fires burned through the area, and the data was deprioritized." I asked if he knew about the 2011 team. He said he didn't. I asked about the markers Linden had found. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "If someone stamped no return on a survey marker in 1987, it wasn't because they didn't want anyone to come back to check the data. It's because they didn't come back themselves." I asked him what he thought was under the clearing. He exhaled slowly, a long, measured breath, and said, "I don't think it matters what I think. I think what matters is that someone decided it was better if nobody knew, and the fact that we're still not supposed to know, 30 years later, tells you everything about the answer. I want to be clear about something. I am not claiming that there is something supernatural beneath the southern backcountry of Yellowstone National Park. I am not claiming that there is something alive under the ground. I am telling you what 3 people told me, in their own words, about an experience that changed how they understood the place they were standing. I'm telling you that an area was closed and never reopened, that the reason was never made public, and that the people who were there last came away with the sense that they had been standing on the surface of something that was not geology, something that responded to their presence, something that tapped. The zone remains closed as of this year. The closure has been renewed annually, without modification since 2011. The permit system now describes it simply as a restricted area, no reason given, no duration specified. If you search for it on the park's official maps, you won't find it marked. But you'll notice, if you look carefully, a blank space, a small, featureless gap between labeled features, where the topographic lines seem to crowd together and then stop, as if the cartographer reached that point and decided there was nothing worth drawing, or as if they were told not to. I still think about something Lyndon said during our first phone call, early in the conversation, before he told me any of the details. I had asked him, as an icebreaker, what it was like working in Yellowstone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's beautiful. Everyone knows that. But there's something people don't talk about. When you're out there, really out there, in the parts that nobody visits, you start to realize that the ground is alive, not metaphorically. The whole park sits on top of something that's moving and breathing and generating heat. And most of the time, you can ignore it. You can walk over it and camp on it and pretend it's just dirt. But every once in a while, you feel it shift, and you remember that you're standing on a skin, a thin skin, and you have no idea what's underneath." I asked him if that scared him. He said, "It didn't used to." The last thing I want to mention is something that may mean nothing. In February of 2020, the USGS published a routine update to its seismic monitoring data for the Yellowstone caldera system. Buried in an appendix of the report, in a table of minor seismic events recorded during the previous fiscal year, there was an entry for a series of low-magnitude tremors originating from the park's southern backcountry. The tremors were described as shallow, non-tectonic, and rhythmically irregular. They occurred at a depth of approximately 2 meters. They lasted for 6 hours. They were recorded on a single monitoring station and did not appear on any adjacent stations, suggesting an extremely localized source. The entry included a note from the reviewing seismologist. It read, "Source mechanism indeterminate. Waveform does not correspond to known volcanic, tectonic, or hydrothermal signatures. Recommend further investigation." No further investigation was noted in the report. The tremors were recorded on September 22nd, the anniversary to the day of the team's arrival in the clearing. That could be a coincidence. Dates repeat, instruments glitch. The Earth moves in ways we don't fully understand, and sometimes the data means nothing. But I keep coming back to the tapping, the clusters, the silence between them. 3, then nothing. 4, then nothing. 2, then nothing. Like something counting, or something trying to communicate, or something simply reminding the surface above it that it was there, that it had always been there, that it was patient and warm and waiting. And I think about Lyndon, wherever he is, on his houseboat, surrounded by water, surrounded by nothing solid, sleeping above a depth that he hopes is deep enough. And I wonder if he still wakes at 2:15, and I wonder if the water is warm. I don't have an ending for this. I don't think there is one. The area is still closed, the records are still sealed, the ground is still warm, and somewhere beneath 22 inches of calcium white soil, in a perfect circle of dead trees in the southern backcountry of a national park visited by 4 million people a year, there is a smooth, dark, featureless surface that hums and taps and waits, and no one has been allowed to go back and ask it why. That concludes tonight's file. If you've ever experienced something strange or unexplained, I'd love to hear your story. You can share it in the comments or send it to the email in the description. It might become a future case on Midnight Files. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join me for more documentary-style horror stories. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones we never forget.